For decades, WWE has given us countless moments and stories that have become core memories. But behind the glitz and glamour, there's an entire world of controversies, scandals, and wild stories that WWE doesn't want you to know. From serious allegations to steroid scandals, from in-ring deaths to court cases, in this video, we're covering 1 full hour of dark WWE stories you weren't supposed to know, starting with the most evil WWE wrestlers of all time, who committed terrible crimes. Jimmy Superfly Snuka was one of the most electrifying performers wrestling had ever seen. At one time, he was one of the hottest acts in the WWF, but behind the spotlight, a very different story was unfolding. On May 10, 1983, Snuka's girlfriend, Nancy Argentino, was found dead in their hotel room in Allentown, Pennsylvania, at the age of 23. She had a skull fracture, bruising across her body, and signs of severe trauma. Her death was ruled a homicide. Snuka told police a series of shifting, contradictory stories. First, he said she'd fallen. Then, he said she'd hit her head. The accounts changed every time someone asked. But despite the findings, despite the inconsistencies, and despite a prior incident just months earlier where 9 police officers and attack dogs were needed to subdue Snuka after he'd hurt Nancy in another motel room, the case quietly disappeared. Within weeks, it was gone. A long-standing rumor, never proven but never fully dismissed, suggests that Vince McMahon himself intervened. That Vince paid off the officers because Snuka was too valuable for the WWF to lose. Whatever the reason, Nancy Argentino's death was swept under the rug for over 3 decades. Snuka continued wrestling. He was celebrated. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 1996. The wrestling world moved on as if nothing had ever happened. It wasn't until 2015 that charges were finally filed. Snuka was indicted for the killing of Nancy Argentino, 32 years after the fact. But by then, he was suffering from advancing dementia and was ruled mentally unfit to stand trial. He died in January 2017, aged 73, without ever facing justice. Nancy Argentino never got hers. In 1996, Tammy Sytch, better known as Sunny, was the most downloaded woman on the entire internet. She was a genuine mainstream star, and in an era when female performers were largely treated as decoration, Sunny had wit, presence, and she helped reshape what a woman's role in wrestling could actually look like, which makes everything that followed all the more tragic. Behind the scenes, Sunny was already becoming one of the most difficult people in the locker room. She was described by colleagues as manipulative, volatile, and almost narcissistic. Her long-term partner Chris Candido was driven to his lowest points repeatedly by her behavior. After her WWE run ended, the downward spiral accelerated. Arrests for driving under the influence started piling up. Over the course of roughly a decade, Sunny racked up an almost unbelievable number of run-ins with law enforcement, DUIs, violations of court orders, public disturbances. She did stints in jail. She went through rehab. She came out and did it again. Through all of it, she blamed everyone else, everyone but herself. But then came March 25th, 2022, and what Sunny did on that night had no escaping. Sunny was behind the wheel in Ormond Beach, Florida, driving at high speed while more than 3 times over the legal alcohol limit. She plowed into the back of a stationary car driven by 75-year-old Julian Lassiter. Julian died as a result of the crash. Sunny was arrested, charged, and in 2023, sentenced to 17 years in prison. Her legacy is complicated, but the consequences of her actions weren't. However, Sunny wasn't the most evil female in wrestling. That title belongs to someone else. For most of wrestling history, if you wanted to be a female wrestler in America, you went through one person. The fabulous Moolah. Moolah held the Women's World Championship for the better part of 3 decades, a reign so long it became the stuff of legend. She trained wrestlers, booked wrestlers, and even managed their careers. She was the gatekeeper, the trailblazer, the woman who, by official records, kept women's wrestling alive during the decades when nobody else cared about it. That's the version that ended up in the WWE Hall of Fame. But the other version is darker, and something the company doesn't want you to see. Moolah ran a training school out of her property in Columbia, South Carolina. Young women who wanted to break into the business would come to her. On the surface, it looked like mentorship, but in reality, according to a significant number of her former trainees, it was closer to a trap. Former wrestlers who trained under Moolah have described a system where she took enormous cuts of their earnings, sometimes as high as 50%, while also charging them for training, housing, and booking fees. Because she controlled access to the entire women's wrestling market in North America, there was nowhere else to go. You worked on her terms, or you didn't work. But the financial control was only part of it. More serious allegations emerged over the years from multiple former trainees. Some claimed that Moolah would book them for appearances and matches in unsafe environments, knowing full well what they were walking into. Others alleged that she knowingly sent young women to promoters and venues where they would be taken advantage of and did nothing to stop it. Moolah died in 2007 and was widely mourned as a legend of the business. But then in 2018, when WWE announced plans to name a women's battle royal at WrestleMania 34 in her honor, the reaction was immediate. Former wrestlers and wrestling historians flooded social media with the allegations that had been circulating for years. Corporate sponsors, including Snickers, publicly pressured WWE to pull Moolah's name, and within days, they did. What Moolah built was real. The barriers she broke were real. But so were the stories told by the women who passed through her school, and for many of them, the woman they described was nothing like the legend on the poster. However, while Moolah's actions went away with her, this next wrestler did something so heinous that his son had to live with the burden throughout his life. Most wrestling fans have never heard of Grizzly Smith, but most wrestling fans know his son, Jake the Snake Roberts. Jake's promos, his in-ring presence, his ability to make audiences uneasy, it was unlike anything else. What fewer people know is where that darkness came from. It came from his home. Aurelian Smith Sr., known in wrestling circles as Grizzly Smith, was a territory-era wrestler who spent most of his life on the road. Like many wrestlers of his generation, he was largely absent from his family. But what Grizzly did went far beyond neglect. Jake Roberts has spoken openly about the fact that his mother was just 13 years old when he was born. Grizzly was an adult. That detail alone says everything you need to know about the kind of man he was. But it went further. According to his daughter Robin Smith, who wrestled in WWE as Rockin' Robin, Grizzly began abusing her when she was around 8 or 9 years old. Few years later, Robin and her mother left the house and made it clear there would be serious consequences if Grizzly ever tried to get close to them again. Then, 2 weeks later, Robin's half-sister Jolene disappeared, and Robin has stated publicly that she believes her father orchestrated it, that Jolene knew things about Grizzly that could have cost him his career and his freedom, and that she was silenced before she could tell anyone. The case was never solved. Grizzly showed almost no public reaction to Jolene's disappearance. He continued working in wrestling. He was spoken of warmly by colleagues who knew the public-facing version of him. And the full truth of what happened to Jolene Smith remains unknown to this day. Jake Roberts has spent decades in therapy processing what his father did to their family. That damage, the kind that starts in childhood and never fully leaves, is the real legacy of Grizzly Smith. What he left behind wasn't a legacy built on matches or promos, it was a family full of broken people. But Grizzly Smith wasn't the only wrestler from the territory era who was a sicko. Buck Zumhofe wanted to be remembered as the rock and roll rebel. In the AWA during the 1980s, he was entertaining, he was over with the crowd, and he carved out a decent career for himself in an era full of larger-than-life characters. But there was something deeply wrong with Buck Zumhofe, and the wrestling business, in the way it so often did, looked the other way for years. In 1986, Zumhofe was convicted of inappropriate conduct with a minor. He served time. And then, remarkably, the AWA took him back. The WWF used him as a jobber. Independent promotions booked him. The wrestling world simply absorbed what had happened and carried on. But then it happened again. Another conviction, another minor, another stretch of prison time. And again, after he was released, he found bookings. He kept working. People kept letting him through the door. But what nobody knew was that the worst of it was happening much closer to home. From 1999 to 2011, Zumhofe subjected his own daughter to years of abuse, beginning when she was a teenager. He kept her isolated, he controlled her world, and he brought her to wrestling shows with him. Shows where other workers noticed that something about the way they interacted wasn't right. Nobody said anything, but they couldn't shake the feeling. His daughter eventually found the courage to go to the police. From the moment of his arrest to his sentencing took less than a year. In 2014, a judge handed down a 25-year sentence. Zumhofe's response to the verdict was to run. He bolted from the courtroom and tried to escape through a bathroom window before being caught and restrained. Even at the end, he was still trying to get away with it. The rock and roll gimmick, the boombox, the sequined jumpsuit, none of it means anything anymore. Buck Zumhofe is one of the most despicable people the wrestling business ever allowed to operate within it. And the business has to own some of that, because it kept opening the door for him long after it had every reason not to. But while Zumhofe was evil, this next wrestler on our list ended up taking someone's life. Puerto Rican wrestling in the 1980s was its own world. While WWE had larger-than-life characters like Hogan and Warrior, Puerto Rico was known for passionate crowds, Brutal matches, blood feuds that felt genuinely personal. And at the center of it all was Jose Gonzalez, a tough, gritty brawler who the crowds completely adored. He was also one of the co-founders of the World Wrestling Council, which meant he wasn't just a performer, he had power behind the scenes. On July 16, 1988, the WWC held an event at the Juan Ramon Ribas Stadium in Bayamon, Puerto Rico. It was a big card, featuring international names including Bruiser Brody, a 6'8" force of nature who was one of the most feared and respected wrestlers on the planet. Brody was a draw wherever he went, but he was also known as difficult. At some point before the event, Gonzalez asked Brody to step into the shower area of the locker room for a private conversation. Wrestlers who were present heard raised voices. Then, within moments, Brody staggered out clutching his abdomen. Gonzalez emerged holding a bloodied knife. Brody had been stabbed twice, once in the stomach, once in the chest. Wrestlers rushed to help him as the horrifying realization of what had just happened set in. Brody was rushed to hospital, but the ambulance took too long to arrive through the crowded streets. Bruiser Brody died the following day at 42 years old. Gonzalez was arrested and charged. The trial that followed stunned the wrestling world. Key witnesses, mostly American wrestlers, struggled to participate due to language barriers, travel difficulties, and what many described as a hostile environment around the case. Gonzalez claimed self-defense. The jury, composed of local Puerto Rican fans who knew Gonzalez as a community hero, acquitted him and he walked free. Gonzalez continued wrestling in Puerto Rico for years after Brody's death. He remained popular with local fans. Bruiser Brody's son grew up without his father. The men who were in that locker room carried what they saw for the rest of their lives, and Jose Gonzalez never faced the consequences of his actions. But if you think what Gonzalez did was bad, let's talk about the biggest tragedy in wrestling history. On June 22, 2007, Chris Benoit was scheduled to appear at a pay-per-view to face CM Punk. But when showtime came, he wasn't present in the building. Friends and colleagues knew immediately that something was wrong. When police entered his home in Fayetteville, Georgia, they found Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel, all dead. What the investigation revealed was that over the course of a single weekend, Benoit had taken the lives of his wife and his young child before ending his own life. The wrestling world went into a state of complete shock. His matches, his highlight packages, his name were all scrubbed from WWE history. But then came the question that the entire industry had to sit with. How did this happen? Months after his death, researchers examined Benoit's brain. What they found was catastrophic. Decades of unprotected chair shots, diving headbutts, and accumulated concussions had left his brain tissue in ruins. It didn't excuse what he did, but it forced a change in the world of wrestling. Chair shots to the head were banned almost immediately after Benoit. Concussion protocols were overhauled, wellness policies were strengthened. Chris Benoit's name will never appear on a WWE broadcast again. His legacy will never be rehabilitated, but the conversation his death forced about wrestler safety may have saved lives in the years since. But while Benoit's death got widespread media coverage, many wrestler deaths got swept under the rug by WWE, and for years, fans didn't even discover that their favorite wrestlers had died. Up next, let's look at the wrestlers whose death was ignored by WWE. While some WWE legends get tribute shows and 10-bell salutes, most wrestler deaths are quietly swept under the rug and completely overlooked. From popular divas to former main eventers, this is every wrestler whose death was ignored by the WWE. Kicking off our list with one of the most dominant monsters of the mid-2000s, Umaga. Eddie Fatu had wrestling in his blood as part of one of the most legendary wrestling families, and being related to names like Roman Reigns, the Usos, and Solo Sikoa. After working as Jamal in 3-Minute Warning, he returned to the company in 2006 as the Samoan Bulldozer. Covered in tribal tattoos with wild face paint, he became unstoppable. Umaga's dominance led to multiple WWE Championship matches against John Cena and a high-profile WrestleMania match in the Battle of the Billionaires. He captured the Intercontinental Championship twice and had legendary battles with Jeff Hardy, CM Punk, and Triple H. But behind the scenes, things weren't going well. In 2007, he was suspended for violating the wellness policy. Then in June 2009, after a second violation and refusing rehab, WWE terminated his contract immediately. Umaga kept wrestling on the indies, with his final match on November 28, 2009. Just days later, on December 4th, his wife found him unresponsive with blood coming from his nose. He suffered 2 massive heart attacks and passed away at just 36 years old. Forensic analysis revealed a combination of painkillers along with heart and liver disease. WWE's response was ice cold. They posted a brief statement on their website, but that was it. No tribute video, no mention on Raw. For years, the former Intercontinental Champion remained erased from history, and it was only after the bloodline became popular that commentators started mentioning the Samoan Bulldozer. But while Umaga's legacy lives on through the bloodline, let's talk about a wrestler who hasn't been mentioned in almost 2 decades. Andrew Martin had everything Vince McMahon loved. Standing 6 feet 6 inches with a granite physique, Test looked like a megastar. His big break came in 1999 with a romantic storyline involving Stephanie McMahon. They became engaged, and at SummerSlam, he defeated Shane McMahon. Everything pointed toward main event stardom, but then Triple H crashed their wedding, revealing he'd married Stephanie in Vegas. This legendary moment marked the end of Test's push. According to Vince Russo, Test was supposed to get the storyline, but Vince felt he wasn't ready and gave it to Triple H instead. Test never recovered. He spent years in the mid-card, but nothing stuck. Released in 2004, he returned for ECW in 2006, but his body was breaking down. A spinal fusion surgery made things worse. In February 2007, he was suspended for wellness policy violations and released weeks later. Test's life spiraled with 2 DUI arrests. In August 2008, desperate, he entered rehab. On March 13, 2009, 4 days before his 34th birthday, a neighbor found him motionless. He'd died from an accidental overdose, and later doctors discovered Test had severe CTE from years of head trauma. Despite being an Attitude-era fixture for nearly a decade, WWE never acknowledged his death. At a time when concussions were becoming controversial, acknowledging Test would raise uncomfortable questions about the company's role in wrestler safety. Till this day, fans wonder how different the wrestling landscape would look if Test got the push during the Attitude Era instead of Triple H. However, Test wasn't the only wrestler from the Attitude Era whose death was ignored. At 6 feet 9 inches and over 500 pounds, Viscera was one of the most recognizable stars in WWE. He spent over a decade entertaining fans under multiple personas. Starting in 1993 as Mabel in Men on a Mission, he won the WWE Tag Team Championship in 1994. His biggest moment came winning the 1995 King of the Ring, earning a WWE Championship match at SummerSlam against Diesel. In 1999, Frazier returned as Viscera, the Ministry of Darkness enforcer. Complete with bleached mohawk and whiteout contacts, he was genuinely terrifying. His third run started in 2004. Evolving into the world's largest love machine, with comedic segments alongside Lillian Garcia. In 2007, he became Big Daddy V on ECW before his release in August 2008. After leaving WWE, Frazier continued wrestling on the indies. He'd always battled weight issues, suffering from high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. But doctors warned him his blood pressure was dangerously high. Frazier responded by cutting salt and sugar, losing over 100 pounds and reaching healthy levels. He was finally getting his life together. However, on February 18, 2014, 4 days after his 43rd birthday, Viscera suffered a fatal heart attack. Fellow wrestlers like Tommy Dreamer and MVP posted heartfelt tributes, but WWE's response was shockingly minimal. They posted a brief statement and aired a short tribute only after massive fan backlash. He wasn't involved in any controversy or scandal. His only crime was not being a main event star. Despite 15 years of entertaining millions, Vince treated his death like an afterthought. But while Viscera never reached the main event spot, let's talk about a man who was supposed to be the next big star. At just 18 years old, Lance Cade trained under Shawn Michaels at his San Antonio Academy, alongside Bryan Danielson. Cade signed with WWE in 2000, spending time in developmental before joining Raw in 2003. After struggling as a singles competitor, Cade was paired with Trevor Murdoch in 2005. They won the World Tag Team Championship 3 times over 3 years, feuding with DX and the Hardys. In May 2008, Cade turned on Murdoch and aligned with Chris Jericho during his legendary heel run. Cade attacked his mentor Shawn Michaels on Raw, and it looked like he was set for a big push. But in October 2008, disaster struck. Cade suffered a seizure on a flight caused by painkillers. Vince immediately fired him, but surprisingly re-signed him in September 2009. After getting released again in April 2010, Cade entered rehab on his own. He wrestled in Japan, with his final match on July 4, 2010. On August 10th, Cade was hospitalized with breathing difficulty, but discharged himself. 2 days later, at his father's home, his heart gave out. Years of painkillers had enlarged his heart. WWE posted a brief statement and nothing more. Even his mentor Shawn Michaels stayed silent. He could have been the next big star, but became another forgotten name. But while Lance Cade's career fizzled out before his big push, let's talk about one of the most entertaining wrestlers of the Attitude Era, whose death was overlooked by WWE. Michael Lockwood, also known as Crash Holly, made his debut in 1989 and spent a decade on the independent circuit before WWE signed him in 1998. He debuted in 1999 as the kayfabe cousin of Bob "Hardcore" Holly, and their relationship was comedic gold. Crash quickly became a fan favorite, particularly in the hardcore division. Beyond the hardcore division, Crash won the Tag Team Championship and later captured both the European and Light Heavyweight Championships. For 5 years, Crash entertained millions with his scrappy underdog persona and comedy segments. But behind the laughter, Lockwood was struggling. In June 2003, WWE released him. He signed with TNA as Mad Mikey in July and wrestled his final match on November 1, 2003. Just 5 days later, tragedy struck. On November 6, 2003, Lockwood was found dead at fellow wrestler Stevie Richards' house in Florida. The autopsy revealed he had ingested 90 pills and died of an overdose. WWE included him in a tribute video at ECW One Night Stand in 2005, 2 years after his death. But there was no tribute on Raw or SmackDown when he passed. His friend and kayfabe cousin Molly Holly later released a DVD where portions of the proceeds went to Crash's daughter's education fund. But WWE itself acted like he never existed, erasing one of the Attitude Era's most memorable characters from history. However, Crash wasn't the only comedic wrestler whose demise was ignored. After stints in various territories, Matt Osborne returned to WWF in September 1992 and was transformed into Doink the Clown. This wasn't a happy, balloon-twisting clown. The original Doink was sinister, a twisted prankster who tormented opponents like Crush, Bret Hart, and Randy Savage. The character resonated with fans, and Doink was being featured prominently on television. But behind the scenes, Osborne was battling serious substance issues. In late 1993, according to Osborne, Bam Bam Bigelow reported him to management for using substances in a hotel hallway, leading to his termination. WWE continued the Doink character with Ray Apollo and others through 1995, but the original was gone. Osborne had a brief stint in ECW, but it didn't lead anywhere. For the next 2 decades, Osborne wrestled sporadically on the independent circuit. On June 28, 2013, Osborne's girlfriend found him unresponsive in their Texas apartment. The cause of death was ruled an accidental drug overdose. 2 years later, in June 2015, Osborne's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against WWE, alleging the company promoted violence and contributed to Osborne's mental state. WWE dismissed the claims, and the lawsuit was eventually thrown out. The company posted a brief statement acknowledging his passing but offered no tribute on television. They referenced the Doink character occasionally, but Matt Osborne, the man who made it iconic, has been largely erased from history. But switching gears from Doink's tragedy, let's talk about arguably the most groundbreaking female wrestler in history. After training under Killer Kowalski, Chyna caught the attention of Triple H and Shawn Michaels in 1996. They brought her to WWE in 1997 as Triple H's bodyguard, billing her as the 9th wonder of the world. Chyna shattered every glass ceiling imaginable. She was the first woman to enter the Royal Rumble, the first to qualify for King of the Ring, and most remarkably, the first and only woman to win the Intercontinental Championship. As a founding member of Degeneration X, she became one of the biggest stars of the Attitude Era. But behind the scenes, her personal life was unraveling. Her real-life relationship with Triple H ended when he began dating Stephanie McMahon. In 2001, contract negotiations broke down. According to Jim Ross, Chyna demanded over $1 million, which Vince found unrealistic. Her sister later revealed Chyna was offered $400,000 but refused. By 2001, she was gone. After WWE, Chyna's life spiraled. She had brief stints in New Japan and TNA, but never recaptured her glory. She moved to Japan to teach English before returning to the United States in 2015, struggling with depression and continued substance issues. On April 17, 2016, Chyna was found unresponsive in her California home. The autopsy revealed she died from an overdose of alcohol combined with anxiety medications, painkillers, and sleeping aids. For years leading to her death, WWE refused to acknowledge her. It wasn't until 2019, 3 years after she died, that Chyna was inducted into the Hall of Fame as part of Degeneration X. Even then, it felt like an afterthought. The woman who broke barriers and paved the way for today's women's revolution was treated as an embarrassment in her final years, and WWE only honored her when she could no longer see it. However, Chyna wasn't the only female wrestler whose death was ignored. Ashley Massaro was born in New York and graduated from SUNY Albany with a degree in communications. A frequent swimsuit pageant contestant, she caught WWE's attention and entered the 2005 Raw Diva Search, winning a one-year, $250,000 contract. The problem? She had almost zero wrestling training and essentially had to learn on the fly. Despite her inexperience, Massaro became popular quickly. After being drafted to SmackDown, she became the valet for tag team champions Paul London and Brian Kendrick. She became a regular on the Blue brand and one of the most beloved female stars on the roster. In July 2008, Ashley requested her release to care for her sick 7-year-old daughter. WWE granted it, and she left wrestling. She later appeared briefly on reality shows and worked as a radio DJ for a Long Island station. But in 2016, Massaro joined a massive class action lawsuit with 60 former wrestlers against WWE. She claimed she suffered multiple documented concussions, a fractured spine, debilitating back injuries, and had a metal plate inserted in her ankle. She alleged Vince McMahon ordered a cast sawed off her wrist weeks early so she could wrestle on TV. Massaro stated she suffered from depression, migraines, and severe memory loss, which she attributed to repeated head trauma that the company failed to properly diagnose or treat. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2018, with a judge calling it frivolous. On May 15, 2019, Massaro finished answering fan mail but didn't show up for her radio shift. At 5:23 a.m. the next morning, paramedics found her unresponsive at her New York home. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. She was just 39 years old, 10 days before her 40th birthday. WWE posted a brief statement and showed a graphic during Money in the Bank weekend, but that was it. They wanted to move past her as quickly as possible, likely because of the pending lawsuits and serious allegations she had made. Ashley should have been a legend. Instead, she became one of wrestling's forgotten names. Up next, let's look at the most degenerate WWE wrestlers ever. From addictions to shocking allegations, from creeps to bullies, these are the most degenerate WWE wrestlers of all time. Jeff Hardy was one of the most loved stars of the mid-2000s. The face paint, the recklessness, the high-flying moves, he was truly one of a kind. The Hardy Boys tag team with his brother Matt is legit legendary. As a singles guy, he finally captured the WWE Championship in 2008 after years of fans willing him to the top. Multiple Intercontinental reigns, 3 TNA World titles, Grand Slam champion. His in-ring resume is real, but so is the other resume. His first WWE release was in 2003 due to failed wellness tests and erratic behavior. In 2009, his North Carolina home was raided and police found hundreds of prescription pills, steroids, and cocaine. He pleaded guilty to trafficking charges and served 10 days in jail. But his lowest point came in TNA on March 13, 2011 at the Victory Road pay-per-view, where Hardy was scheduled to main event against Sting for the world title. He walked to the ring barely able to stand, staggering down the ramp visibly under the influence. The match lasted 88 seconds. Sting pinned him as an act of mercy and walked out furious. Hardy later admitted he'd taken muscle relaxers before the show and had no business being there, but the pattern kept repeating. He was arrested for DUI in 2018, public intoxication in 2019. Another DUI in 2022 while in AEW, registering nearly 4 times the legal limit. Each time, suspension, rehab, return, and eventually another arrest. He's currently back in TNA with Matt, reportedly approaching 3 years sober. Fans still cheer him like nothing happened, and maybe that's the most Jeff Hardy thing of all, a man who kept falling and a crowd that kept catching him. Had Jeff cleaned up his act in 2009, he could have been a multi-time WrestleMania main eventer by today. Instead, he's reduced to nostalgia pops and a highlight reel. But while Jeff was his own worst enemy, this next wrestler was a threat to everyone he came in contact with. New Jack debuted in 1992 and became a fixture of ECW as one half of the Gangstas. In Paul Heyman's Bloodbath promotion, New Jack found a home. He dove off scaffolding, bled through entire matches, and carried a genuine menace that most wrestlers could only imitate. The problem was that the violence wasn't a gimmick. It was his real-life persona. In 1996, a 17-year-old named Eric Koulas lied about his age and training to get on an ECW card. New Jack opened his forehead with a surgical scalpel and severed 2 arteries as Koulas nearly bled out in the ring. In 2003, veteran Gypsy Joe no-sold his offense during a match. New Jack decided to stop working and started genuinely beating the 69-year-old with a chain and a barbed wire bat. In 2004, a Florida novice named William Jason Lane threw some legit punches during their match. New Jack pulled a metal blade from his gear and stabbed Lane in the head repeatedly. New Jack died of a heart attack in May 2021 at 58, but right up to the very end, he continued being a menace to society. However, New Jack wasn't the only wrestler causing problems on the indie scene. Marty Scurll was one of the most exciting talents the British independent scene had ever produced. The villain gimmick with the umbrella and theatrics made him stand out globally. He won titles in Progress, Revolution Pro, Ring of Honor, and New Japan's junior heavyweight division. He was in the Bullet Club. He was close friends with Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, and Cody Rhodes, the people who built AEW. There was a version of the future where Marty Scurll was a cornerstone of that company, but that never happened. In June 2020, the speaking out movement changed everything for Marty. A woman came forward describing an incident from 2015, where she alleged Scurll pursued her through the evening and pressured her into getting physical in a hotel hallway. Her friend walked in and intervened before it went further. Scurll responded publicly and did not deny it happened. Ring of Honor launched an investigation, and Scurll was gone from the company by January 2021. WWE isn't interested. AEW never called, and his only option is to work small independent shows. Marty Scurll should have been a star. Instead, One Night in England cemented his wrestling legacy as a degenerate. However, Scurll isn't the only Marty who dug his own grave. As one half of the Rockers with Shawn Michaels, Marty Jannetty was genuinely gifted, fast, athletic, and one of the best sellers of his generation. The team won the AWA Tag Team titles twice and were beloved fixtures of WWF television. When Michaels turned on him and sent him through the barbershop window in 1992, it was one of the era's defining moments. Jannetty briefly reached singles heights, winning the Intercontinental Championship and feuding with Michaels, but his career never stabilized. The reason was simple. Jannetty partied himself out of every opportunity he was given. Cocaine possession arrest in 1992, multiple DUIs in the 2000s, fired, rehired, fired again, a cycle that kept repeating for years. But the substance abuse is almost secondary to what came later. In August 2020, Jannetty posted and then deleted a Facebook confession describing an incident from when he was 13 years old, claiming he had beaten a man with a brick. Columbus police confirmed they were investigating. Jannetty later backpedaled, claiming it was a wrestling storyline, then gave contradictory interviews on local radio where he confirmed some details but denied others. Whether it was a confession, a cry for attention, or something in between, only Jannetty knows. What's harder to dismiss is the account from former wrestler Brutus Beefcake, who alleged on record that the Rockers used to drug female fans' drinks at bars and take advantage of them. Jannetty has never addressed it directly, but his story clearly doesn't have a clean ending. However, while Jannetty was never a world champion, this next wrestler got everything handed to him, only to throw it all away. Alberto Del Rio arrived in WWE in 2010 with the company's hype train heavily behind him. The Mexican aristocrat gimmick with a personal ring announcer, luxury cars, dripping contempt for the crowd, it fit him perfectly. Within a year, he had won the Royal Rumble and the WWE Championship. He went on to win world titles across WWE, making him one of the most decorated Latin American wrestlers in history. However, his career never reached the heights it was supposed to. He had 2 WWE runs, both ending badly. An Impact run that ended with a suspension over a domestic dispute with his then-girlfriend Paige, who later said publicly that she experienced mental and physical abuse throughout the relationship and that it contributed to her developing an eating disorder. Del Rio pursued charges against her following an airport altercation, then dropped them. But then came May 2020, and it made everything that happened prior look tame in comparison. Del Rio was arrested in San Antonio, Texas, after his girlfriend at the time reported an attack that lasted over 14 hours. According to the police report, he accused her of being unfaithful, smashed her phone, smashed her laptop, and attempted to burn her passport so she couldn't leave. A grand jury later indicted him on 1 count of aggravated kidnapping. The charges were dropped in December 2021. He resumed wrestling, captured the AAA Mega Championship in 2024, but thanks to all the controversies and scandals, Del Rio's chances of ever returning to WWE are virtually zero. But if we're talking of wrestling degenerates, we simply can't leave out Sunny. Tammy Sytch was the biggest female star wrestling had in the mid-1990s. She was the most downloaded woman on the internet in 1996, which in the dial-up era was an actual cultural milestone. However, what followed was a downward spiral carried out almost entirely by her own choices. The arrests started accumulating over the years. DUIs, restraining order violations, public intoxication, somewhere north of a dozen run-ins with law enforcement spread across roughly 15 years. She cycled through jail stints and rehab programs, and each time she emerged, she pointed the blame somewhere else. At the business, at former partners, at circumstance. Chris Candido, her long-term partner, spent years being dragged through the consequences of her behavior before his death in 2005. She sold explicit content to pay legal bills. She gave interviews from jail. She lived in ways that seemed designed to extract maximum attention for minimum dignity. But then, it all came crashing down on March 25, 2022, and this time, there was no escaping for Sunny. At Ormond Beach, Florida, Sunny was behind the wheel with blood alcohol level more than 3 times the legal limit, and she drove into the back of a stationary car driven by 75-year-old Julian Lasseter, who died from his injuries. In 2023, Sitch was sentenced to 17 years in prison. The tragedy of Tammy Sitch isn't the fall from the 1990s. It's that the fall had so many warning signs and so many chances to stop, and Julian Lasseter paid the price for all of them. However, Sunny wasn't the only problematic name in the 90s, and if we're talking of degenerate wrestlers, we have to talk about the leader of D-Generation X. If you started watching wrestling in the 2000s, you know Shawn Michaels as a great in-ring performer, a universally respected veteran, and a mentor to the young generation in NXT. But the version of HBK who operated through most of the 1990s was one of the most difficult and destructive people in the locker room. The in-ring record doesn't need defending. In the ring, he won multiple world titles, had ladder match classics, Iron Man matches, the kind of WrestleMania moments that get replayed forever. But outside the ring, it was a different story entirely. Michaels was using cocaine from at least the mid-1980s, taking partial payment in the drug during his early territory days. By the Rockers era, he and Jannetty were partying nearly every night on the road. As his singles career took off, the substances escalated. Painkillers, alcohol, pills, and his behavior followed. He was part of the Click faction alongside Triple H, Diesel, and Razor Ramon, a group that wielded enormous influence over WWF booking and used it liberally to protect themselves at the expense of the rest of the roster. Wrestlers who didn't play along found themselves buried. Bret Hart, among others, has been vocal for decades about what that dynamic cost him. Michaels showed up to television tapings in states that made working with him genuinely difficult. Triple H has described rolling him back to hotel rooms on luggage carts and setting alarms to check he was still breathing. His famous 1997 promo about losing his smile, which allowed him to vacate the WWF Championship, was widely believed to be a cover for not wanting to drop the belt to Bret Hart. By 2002, his 2-year-old son found him passed out on the couch and something changed. He got clean. He came back as a born-again Christian and dedicated his life to Jesus. But while we're talking about degenerates in wrestling, we gotta talk about Vince McMahon. From making out with Trish Stratus in front of his wife to facing his own daughter on worldwide TV, this is every time Vince McMahon went too far in the WWE, starting with the time when he was caught backstage with Tori Wilson. Back in the early 2000s, after WWE beat WCW in the ratings war, Vince McMahon was high on power, and he made sure to flaunt it on screen. Tori Wilson was one of the former WCW stars who had joined the company after WCW was put out of business by McMahon. During a segment, Vince appeared backstage with Tori and basically asked her how badly she wanted to become a superstar. If she wanted to make it in the company, she'd have to get close to the boss. What followed was a series of increasingly awkward scenes where Vince and Tori kept trying to be alone together, but they were constantly interrupted. First, by Stone Cold Steve Austin, then Kurt Angle, and then Perry Saturn. Finally, they made it to the laundry room where they thought they had some privacy. Tori started getting cozy with Vince, and he was clearly enjoying every second of it. She asked him to close his eyes, but when he opened them again, it was his wife Linda standing right in front of him. Vince tried to play it off like he was just doing his laundry, but Linda wasn't buying any of it. However, that wasn't the only time Vince cheated on Linda on global TV. In early 2001, Vince began a public affair with Trish Stratus while his wife Linda was sitting in a wheelchair in an unresponsive state. Vince would parade Trish around, making out with her right in front of Linda, who just sat there unable to react.
Roping.
But Vince's antics with Trish didn't stop there. In one particularly infamous segment, Vince made Trish get down on all fours in the middle of the ring and bark like a dog. He was screaming at her, humiliating her in front of thousands of people in the arena and millions watching at home. The power trip didn't stop there either. In another segment, Vince actually dumped dirty mop water all over Trish and claimed that he was only using her. The storyline eventually led to a match between Vince and Shane at WrestleMania 17 when Vince lost to Shane after Linda hit Vince with a low blow. But even after getting humiliated by his own son and wife in front of the world, Vince didn't change his ways. In fact, he became more corrupt, more power-hungry, and more willing to cross any line. This was most evident when he booked himself in a romance angle with Brock Lesnar's wife, Sable, in 2003. When Sable returned to the company in 2003, first she was put in a storyline with Tori Wilson, but then she got into a feud against Stephanie where she played Vince McMahon's romantic interest. The two were shown getting cozy together in various segments, with Vince playing up his character as this powerful boss who could have whatever he wanted. But here's the weird part. Just a few years before this, Sable had left WWE on really bad terms and filed a massive lawsuit against Vince and the company. So when she came back and was instantly put into this romantic angle with Vince, it felt strange that someone who had sued the boss for that kind of treatment would then be asked to play his on-screen love interest. However, while we're talking about unhinged Vince McMahon storylines, you simply cannot leave out the Durag Vince arc. At WrestleMania 23 in 2007, Vince McMahon lost the Battle of the Billionaires against Donald Trump, which meant he had to get his head completely shaved bald in the middle of the ring. But what came next was absolutely wild and became one of the most bizarre character changes in history. Instead of just accepting his bald head and moving on, Vince decided to completely reinvent his character. He started showing up on Raw wearing a durag, and his whole personality shifted. He began talking differently, using slangs, and trying to incorporate hip-hop culture into his character. It was over the top, it was ridiculous, and it was totally Vince McMahon. He even won the ECW title, and Durag Vince was a thing till that one time when Vince faked his own death in front of the world. On June 11, 2007, Monday Night Raw ended with one of the most shocking moments in the show's history. The final segment showed Vince McMahon walking to his limousine in the parking lot, but right after he entered the limo and closed the door, the entire limo exploded in a massive fireball, and the show went off the air with everyone believing the chairman was dead. The following week, WWE had planned a special 3-hour tribute show to honor the deceased Vince McMahon. They were going to treat it like he'd actually passed away. It was meant to be this huge storyline that would keep people talking for months. But then tragedy struck in real life. Just days before the Vince McMahon tribute episode was supposed to air, the Chris Benoit situation happened. The company immediately scrapped all their plans for the Vince McMahon death storyline and instead turned it into a Chris Benoit tribute show. But while the Benoit incident was tragic, let's talk about the segment that literally turned Vince into a world-famous meme. During the height of Vince's power trip, when he'd regularly put himself in romantic segments with the divas, Stacy Keibler found herself in a segment that's become pretty infamous over the years. The setup was that she wanted to become Vince McMahon's new personal assistant, so she had to audition for the role. The segment showed Stacy doing a seductive dance for Vince while he sat there watching with this look of amazement on his face. If you've ever seen that meme of Vince's eyes getting wider and wider with excitement, it comes from this exact moment. But while this segment became immortalized on the internet, let's talk about the time when Vince literally had wrestlers kissing his backside in front of the world. If you grew up watching the WWE in the 2000s, I'm sure you remember the Kiss My Ass Club, where Vince McMahon would force everyone from wrestlers to commentators to literally get down on their knees and kiss his bare backside in the middle of the ring. However, there were times when Vince got a taste of his own medicine. For example, that one time when The Rock showed up on SmackDown and forced Vince to kiss Rikishi's buttocks, or when DX shoved Vince's head right up Big Show's backside during their Hell in a Cell match. But while all of this was pretty wild, let's talk about the time when Vince humiliated his own daughter in the ring. In 2003, Vince McMahon booked himself in a wrestling match against his own daughter. This wasn't just any normal match either. It was an I Quit match at the No Mercy pay-per-view, and it happened because Stephanie refused to resign as the general manager of SmackDown. During the match, just like the name of the event, Vince showed Stephanie absolutely no mercy. He threw her around the ring, slammed her into the mat repeatedly, and at one point even choked her with a lead pipe. The match finally ended when Linda McMahon threw in the towel to save her daughter. But even after the match was over, Vince showed zero remorse for what he'd just done. However, if you thought that was wild, let me tell you about the time when Vince proposed a storyline where he was going to be revealed as the father of Stephanie's child. Yes, you heard that right. In the early 2000s, Vince came up with a storyline idea where he was going to be revealed as the father of his own grandchild. Stephanie wanted to do nothing with it, and luckily the plans were scrapped before the whole thing could play out on TV. It just shows Vince was willing to cross any limit in the name of entertainment. But if you thought wrestling his daughter was weird, Vince somehow topped it by booking himself in a match against God. In early 2006, Vince and Shane got into a storyline with Shawn Michaels, where Vince literally booked a tag team match with him and Shane versus Shawn Michaels and God. The build-up to this match was equally bizarre. Vince created his own religion called McMahonism and declared himself more powerful than any deity. There was this wild segment where he cut a promo inside a church, mocked Triple H's entrance, read the commandments of McMahonism, and even compared himself to God. When it came time for the actual match, Vince introduced God to the ring with a spotlight and heavenly music. The match itself was essentially a handicap match where Shawn had to fight both McMahons by himself. The whole angle was designed to make Vince's character as blasphemous and offensive as possible, and even featured a segment that saw Vince suggestively heel Candice Michelle. Speaking of Candice Michelle, throughout the early 2000s, Vince was involved in several controversial segments with divas like Candice Michelle, Trish Stratus, and even his own daughter that made fans raise eyebrows. But Vince decided to take things a step further and mock Zach Gowen's amputation on worldwide TV. In 2003, Gowen got into a storyline where he was fan of Mr. America, also known as Hulk Hogan. The only problem was that Hogan was feuding with Vince at that time, which immediately put Gowen on Vince's bad side. Vince spent weeks mocking Gowen, humiliating him on TV, and even getting him beat up by wrestlers twice his size. When Vince got bored of this, he simply released Gowen from the company and never mentioned him again. But while Vince managed to dodge the law for years, some wrestlers got arrested multiple times and ruined their own careers. So up next, let's look at what happened to every WWE wrestler who got arrested. From serving years in prison to having their mugshot go viral, this is what happened to every WWE wrestler who got arrested. Kicking things off with one of the most beloved wrestlers of all time, Jeff Hardy. If you grew up watching WWE in the late 90s and 2000s, Jeff Hardy was everything. The guy was doing things in the ring that nobody had ever seen before, flying off ladders, crashing through tables, throwing his body around like it had no limits. But behind all of it, Jeff was fighting something the cameras couldn't see. His personal battles became an open secret in the wrestling world, and things went public in September 2009 when his North Carolina home was raided by law enforcement. Officers found nearly 270 Vicodin pills and anabolic steroids. He was hit with multiple serious charges, including trafficking in controlled substances. His brother Matt bailed him out that same night. He went to TNA during that time and even won the world title there, but his personal struggles followed him. He eventually found his way back to the WWE in 2017, and for a while, it really did look like a comeback story. But the pattern repeated. He was taken in for driving while impaired in 2018, then again for public intoxication in 2019. Each time, WWE gave him another chance. Each time, it happened again. By late 2021, WWE had reached their limit. Jeff walked out of a house show mid-match, leaving through the crowd. The company reportedly offered him a path to treatment, but he turned it down and was released shortly after. He signed with AEW in early 2022, but in June of that year, just months into that run, he was pulled over in Florida. When they approached, Jeff couldn't even get the vehicle into park. What came after the Florida incident was the most honest Jeff had ever been publicly. He later admitted that the summer of 2022 brought him to the lowest point of his life. But to his credit, Jeff did the work. He completed treatment, stayed sober, and returned to wrestling alongside Matt in TNA, where they became tag team champions again. Jeff Hardy deserves to end his story on a high note. The crowd will be ready when that Hall of Fame moment comes. But while Jeff's story still has some redemption in it, our next name had every opportunity and threw every single one of them away. When Alberto Del Rio debuted in 2010, it looked like Vince had found his next Mexican main event star. And for a while, he delivered. In 2011, he won the Royal Rumble, cashed in the Money in the Bank briefcase, and went on to hold both the WWE Championship and the World Heavyweight title. He feuded with names like John Cena, CM Punk, and Sheamus. There was a real window where it looked like Del Rio could be the next biggest international star for years to come. But then, the cracks showed up. His first run ended in 2014 when he was let go after slapping a company employee. But WWE brought him back in 2015, and the second run was messy from day one. He no-showed events, failed a wellness check, and was gone again within a year. After leaving WWE for good in 2016, things outside the ring continued to fall apart. He had a very public and troubled relationship with Paige that kept generating headlines for the wrong reasons. Then, in May 2020, something happened that made all of that look minor by comparison. Del Rio was taken in by police in San Antonio, Texas, on extremely serious charges of kidnapping and assault. A grand jury formally indicted him in October 2020. He faced the possibility of up to 99 years in prison, but the charges were eventually dropped in 2021 after the woman did not cooperate with the prosecution. Del Rio has continued wrestling on the independent circuit and in Mexican promotions since then. But given everything that has happened, it's very unlikely we'll ever see him back in WWE. However, not every arrest story ends in disgrace. Some wrestlers get arrested only to come back and become world champion weeks later. Liv Morgan has been one of the most popular female wrestlers for years. She came up through NXT and eventually earned her spot on the main roster where she became a genuine fan favorite. But in December 2023, her car got pulled over in Florida after a deputy noticed the vehicle crossing lane lines. When the officer approached the Jeep, he said he could smell something. A search turned up a small bag of marijuana and a vape pen containing an oil-like substance. She was booked and released after posting a bond of $3,000. What made the story even more memorable was how Liv described it afterward. She said when the officers first found her personal journal in the car and started reading her goal list out loud, things like wanting to be a WWE Hall of Famer and do some acting. Liv said she was horrified and embarrassed. Her first call after posting bail was to WWE's head of talent relations. He told her to stay quiet, go to work the next day, and act normal. She was not suspended, she was not released, she was not even removed from television. The company handled it quietly and kept her on track. The felony charge was eventually dropped after labs could not confirm the substance in the pen was synthetic. Months later, Liv Morgan was Women's World Champion. The whole thing became more of a wild story she tells in interviews than any kind of lasting mark on her career. She has been open about the experience and said those days are behind her. It is worth noting the contrast here. One mistake, full accountability, one phone call to her employer, and a willingness to face it head-on. And her career not only survived but reached new heights. That is a very different outcome from what happens when people run from their problems instead of owning them. But speaking of very different outcomes, the next name on our list is someone whose personal struggles caught up with her in the most devastating way possible. There was a time when Tammy Sytch was the most downloaded woman on the entire internet. Before the concept of a WWE diva even existed, Sunny was already the blueprint. Smart, quick-talking, physically striking, and capable of holding the attention of an arena full of people. She was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2011, which felt like the right and proper end to a legendary chapter. But the chapter that followed was one of the saddest in wrestling history. The years after her run in wrestling were marked by a long and painful battle with substances, and it spilled over into her legal life in a very serious way. She was taken in multiple times over the years for various incidents, including driving under the influence. In Pennsylvania, where she lived, she racked up 3 DUI convictions and had her license suspended as a result. But Sunny's worst nightmare came in 2022. On March 25, 2022, Sunny was driving on a road in Ormond Beach, Florida. At a red light, her vehicle struck a car driven by a 75-year-old man from Daytona Beach. The force of the crash pushed his car into a third vehicle stopped ahead of him. The man was taken to the hospital, where he passed away. When officers tested Sunny's blood alcohol level, it came back at more than 4 times the legal limit. She was taken in about a week later while staying at a hotel in Daytona Beach. The judge sentenced her to 17 years and 6 months in Florida State Prison. She will not be released until 2039 at the earliest, at which point she will be in her late 60s. It is one of the most tragic stories in wrestling, and it serves as a reminder that the consequences of certain choices stay with us forever. If you had to pick one person to represent what WWE was at its absolute peak, most people would say Stone Cold Steve Austin. During the Attitude Era in the late 1990s, Steve Austin was not just the biggest star in wrestling, he was one of the biggest names in all of entertainment. But off-camera, by 2002, Austin was in a very dark place. His body was breaking down after years of brutal in-ring punishment, particularly to his neck and knees, and his marriage to fellow WWE personality Deborah Marshall was falling apart. In June 2002, police were called to their home in San Antonio, Texas. Officers arrived to find Deborah with a visible welt under her eye and bruises on her face. She told police that Austin had struck her multiple times during an argument before leaving the house. A warrant was issued by the county district attorney, and Austin turned himself in on August 14, 2002. He was charged with misdemeanor assault and released on a $5,000 bond. Years later, Deborah gave interviews in which she described the incident as part of a pattern, not a single moment. She also alleged that WWE had encouraged her to stay quiet to protect Austin's image. But what makes Austin's story complicated is everything that came after. WWE did not turn their back on him. He came back to TV in 2003, remained a beloved figure in the company for years, was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2009, and even came out of retirement to wrestle Kevin Owens at WrestleMania 38. But from one of the most celebrated names in wrestling history, let's turn to one of the most promising young talents who had everything it takes to be a star and managed to lose it all. There are some performers who walk into a wrestling ring and immediately make you feel like you are watching something different. Patrick Clark was one of those people. By the time he transformed into the Velveteen Dream character in NXT, he had already shown flashes of real star potential. There were genuine conversations about what Velveteen Dream could become once he made the jump to the main roster. But serious questions emerged in 2020 when allegations surfaced online. Screenshots of alleged messages spread across social media, and the story picked up speed. WWE conducted an internal investigation and said they found no evidence of wrongdoing, but the damage was already done. Dream disappeared from television. His push vanished overnight. The crowd turned on him at every appearance. By May 2021, Patrick Clark was released from his contract, and then the legal trouble started. In November 2021, Clark was charged with possession and related offenses. In April 2022, he was sentenced to 12 months of probation and ordered to pay court costs. 4 months into that probation, in August 2022, he was arrested again, this time for battery and trespassing. Since then, Clark has made some attempts to get back into wrestling on the independent circuit. But the combination of the original allegations and the multiple arrests has made him essentially untouchable to any major promotion. However, while Dream was released before he reached the main roster, let's talk about the time the biggest star in wrestling today was arrested. Roman Reigns is one of the most decorated performers in WWE history. His run with the undisputed Universal Championship was historic. His character work alongside Paul Heyman and the rest of the bloodline was some of the best long-term storytelling in years. But before all of that, before the Shield, before he became the head of the table and all the championships that followed, there was a night in Pensacola, Florida, in June 2010 that almost changed the entire story. Roman was taken in by Florida State Police and charged with disorderly intoxication, disorderly conduct, and getting into a public fight. He was released on a $1,000 bond and later paid $500 for each of the charges. But here is the thing. Almost nobody knew about it. It did not come to light publicly until 2013, when Roman was already working on the main roster as part of the Shield. His mugshot quietly circulated online, fans connected the dots, and it became one of those pieces of wrestling trivia that surprised a lot of people. To his credit, Roman never let it define him. There were no repeat incidents. The 2010 arrest remained a one-time stumble from before his career had even officially started. Roman Reigns went on to become arguably the biggest name in wrestling in the modern era. However, while Roman's arrest was a one-time thing, the same can't be said about his cousins. If you want to talk about the greatest tag teams in history, the Usos absolutely have to be part of that conversation. But outside the ring, Jimmy and Jay have had consistent problems with the law. Jimmy's first run-in came in 2011 when he was taken in for driving under the influence in Florida. 2 years later, in 2013, he was back in front of a judge, this time for violating that probation by driving with a suspended license. Then in February 2019, he was picked up in Detroit for disorderly conduct and obstruction after getting out of a car during a traffic stop. 5 months after that, in July 2019, he was taken in again, this time for driving under the influence. Jey Uso's own arrest came in January 2018 when he was taken in for driving while impaired following a live event in Texas. But even after getting arrested, the Usos have managed to stay relevant on TV for years. The same can't be said about wrestlers like Ryback, Enzo, and others who destroyed their career with one mistake. From main event feuds to wrestling in empty gyms, from the brightest spotlight to complete obscurity, these are WWE wrestlers who destroyed their careers with a single decision. Kicking things off with a guy who was supposed to be the next Goldberg. Ryback looked like he'd been created in a laboratory specifically for Vince McMahon. The physique, the intensity, the catchphrase, everything about Ryback was straight out of Vince McMahon's fantasy. But then WWE made the mistake of turning him heel when his momentum was at its peak. The shine started wearing off, and Ryback found himself sliding down the card. He eventually won the Intercontinental Championship, but that's where things started getting messy. Ryback had concerns about WWE's pay structure and how lower-card wrestlers were being paid. But instead of handling it professionally, Ryback took his frustrations public while still under contract. When his deal expired in 2016, he walked away. And then he just couldn't stop talking. Ryback spent years relentlessly attacking WWE online. He went after Vince McMahon, buried Triple H's booking decisions, called out other wrestlers, and criticized virtually everything about the company. But Ryback's biggest mistake was when he made insensitive comments about Vince McMahon's mother after she passed away. These days, Ryback legally changed his name to Ryback Reeves and has pivoted to being a content creator focused on nutrition and mukbang videos on YouTube. He occasionally appears at small independent shows, but his days of being considered for any major promotion are long gone. But moving on from Ryback's self-destruction, let's talk about a controversial female superstar who went from the bright lights of WWE to the cold bars of prison. If you asked anyone in the mid-1990s who the most popular woman in wrestling was, the answer would have been unanimous: Sunny. Tammy Sytch wasn't just a manager or a valet. She was a cultural phenomenon. She became the most downloaded person on the entire internet in 1996, appeared on magazine covers, and was an integral part of WWE's Attitude Era Foundation. In 2011, WWE inducted her into the Hall of Fame. It felt like a happy ending for someone who'd overcome personal struggles and substance abuse issues. She'd cleaned up her act, and fans were genuinely happy to see her honored. But the celebration didn't last long. Starting in 2012, Sunny was arrested 5 times for various offenses. The arrests kept coming: DUI charges, domestic violence incidents, violating protective orders. Each time, it seemed like she'd hit rock bottom, and each time, she somehow found a way to go lower. WWE quietly distanced themselves, and what was once a Hall of Fame celebration became an uncomfortable reminder. However, in 2022, Sunny made a huge mistake that ruined her life. On March 25, 2022, while driving under the influence, Sunny caused a fatal car crash that killed a 75-year-old man. She'd been given chance after chance by the legal system, but this time, there were no more chances. In November 2023, Tammy Sytch was sentenced to 17 years in prison. She won't be eligible for release until at least 2039, when she'll be in her late 60s. WWE has scrubbed her from their history wherever possible. Her Hall of Fame induction technically still exists in the record books, but the company will never acknowledge or celebrate it again. But switching gears from Sunny's downfall, let's talk about one of the most polarizing wrestlers of modern times. When Enzo Amore debuted on NXT alongside Big Cass, nobody expected much. But what Enzo lacked in technical ability, he made up for with personality. His motormouth promos and catchphrases got over in a massive way, and Enzo became a solid player in the tag division and the cruiserweight division. However, cracks started showing almost immediately. There were reports of backstage heat, complaints about Enzo's attitude, and whispers that veterans didn't respect him. Allegedly, he was kicked off the tour bus and banned from the locker room at various points. But then, everything came crashing down in January 2018. WWE discovered through a news report that Enzo was under investigation by Phoenix police for an alleged incident dating back to October 2017. The problem wasn't just the allegation itself, it was that Enzo never informed WWE about the investigation. On January 22, 2018, WWE suspended Enzo. The next day, they fired him while he was still Cruiserweight champion, forcing them to vacate the title. Since then, Enzo's career has been chaotic. He's pursued a rap career with barely any success, made sporadic independent wrestling appearances, got into a physical altercation with Joey Janela at a concert, and in one of the wildest moments of 2018, he disguised himself and snuck into Survivor Series just 6 months after being fired. As of 2025, he's still wrestling small shows and releasing music, but there's zero chance WWE ever brings him back. But while Enzo never came close to the main event scene, let's talk about a former world champion who sabotaged his own career. Alberto Del Rio is the perfect example of someone who's given opportunity after opportunity, only to squander every single one of them. He won the 2011 Royal Rumble, cashed in Money in the Bank, and became world champion multiple times. Vince McMahon saw him as the Hispanic superstar the company had been searching for since Eddie's demise. But his first run ended in 2014 under controversial circumstances. According to Del Rio, a WWE social media manager made a hurtful comment toward him, and Del Rio responded by slapping the employee. WWE fired him, and most people assumed that was the end of the story. But then something unexpected happened. WWE brought him back in 2015. It seemed like the company was willing to forgive and move forward. Unfortunately, this second run was a disaster from the start. Del Rio's act felt stale. His relationship with Paige became a constant source of backstage drama, and his attitude made it clear he didn't want to be there. He failed a wellness test, no-showed events, and left the company again in less than a year. However, even after his release, Del Rio kept digging his own grave. He spent years publicly trashing WWE in interviews, burning bridges with other promotions like TNA through unprofessional behavior, and accumulating legal troubles that made him radioactive to major companies. Today, Del Rio occasionally appears for small independent promotions, but his reputation precedes him. But while Del Rio was a former world champion, let's talk about a promising star who sabotaged his career before making it out of NXT. Patrick Clark first appeared on WWE Tough Enough in 2015, and while he didn't win the competition, WWE saw enough potential to sign him to NXT. Initially, he wrestled under his real name with a fairly generic presentation, but in 2017, everything changed when he transformed into the Velveteen Dream. The gimmick was inspired by Prince, flamboyant, theatrical, and unlike anything else in WWE at the time. Dream had the look, the charisma, the mind games, and the ability to back it all up in the ring. Fans and industry insiders alike saw him as a future main eventer on the main roster. But then, 2020 happened, and everything fell apart. Serious allegations surfaced online regarding inappropriate behavior, and WWE quietly pulled Dream from television. His big push evaporated overnight, and he was barely used for the remainder of his contract. In May 2021, WWE released Patrick Clark. But his troubles didn't end there. He was arrested multiple times for battery, trespassing, and other charges. In 2024, Clark attempted a comeback on the independent circuit, performing under the name Velveteen Man. However, he's a shell of what he once was, working tiny venues for promotions most fans have never heard of. But moving on from Dream's downfall, let's rewind all the way back to one of the biggest disasters of the 90s. Marty Jannetty's name has become wrestling shorthand for the guy who didn't make it. Whenever a tag team breaks up and one partner becomes a massive star while the other fades into obscurity, fans call them the Marty Jannetty of the group. When Shawn famously smashed Jannetty through the barbershop window in 1992, WWE had big plans for a singles feud between them culminating at WrestleMania 8. However, that match never happened because Jannetty couldn't stay out of trouble. Shortly before their scheduled WrestleMania match, Jannetty got into a wild altercation with police and was charged with multiple offenses. WWE had no choice but to release him, and their WrestleMania plans were scrapped. Vince McMahon gave Jannetty another chance when he returned in October 1993 to resume his feud with Shawn. The two wrestled at the Royal Rumble for the Intercontinental Championship, and a backstage segment suggested the story would continue to WrestleMania. But once again, Jannetty was fired. This time allegedly for being under the influence during his match with Michaels. While Shawn Michaels became one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, Jannetty bounced between independent promotions. But going from one tag team specialist to another, let's talk about the bizarre downfall of Brad Maddox. Brad Maddox's WWE career is one of the strangest stories in recent memory. When Maddox debuted in 2012, he wasn't supposed to be anything more than a referee, but WWE Creative saw something in him and decided to give him a chance. After interfering in a WWE Championship match between CM Punk and Ryback, Maddox became a featured character on television. His smarmy heel persona worked, and by early 2013, he was named the general manager of Monday Night Raw. Maddox held that position for nearly a year, appearing regularly on WWE's flagship show and gaining valuable experience working with top stars. However, his run as GM ended in 2014, and he transitioned back to being an in-ring wrestler, working non-televised matches and appearing sporadically on television. In November 2015, WWE released him. Most people assumed that was the end of his WWE story. But 7 months later, in June 2016, Maddox made a surprise return. Fans who remembered his entertaining heel work were curious to see what WWE had planned for him this time. But this return lasted exactly 8 days. Brad Maddox was wrestling in a non-televised match at a house show that wouldn't be broadcast or recorded for WWE programming. As a heel, his job was to insult the crowd and get them to boo him. During his promo, Maddox called the fans pricks. Now, wrestlers have said far worse things on live television, but WWE management was in the building, they heard it, and they didn't find it appropriate. Maddox was fired almost immediately after the match. He wasn't given a chance to explain himself or apologize, he was just gone. Since then, Maddox has largely disappeared from the wrestling world. WWE has essentially pretended his entire run never happened. He's rarely mentioned, his segments aren't featured in historical packages, and there's been zero indication the company has any interest in ever working with him again. But while Maddox never made it past the undercard, let's talk about a wrestler who was once supposed to be the next face of the WWE. Mr. Kennedy is the textbook definition of unfulfilled potential. When Kennedy debuted in WWE in 2005, the company had massive plans for him. He had charisma, decent in-ring ability, and that it factor that WWE constantly searches for. By 2007, he'd won the United States Championship and captured the Money in the Bank briefcase at WrestleMania 23. But shortly after winning, he suffered a legitimate injury, and WWE made the controversial decision to take the briefcase away from him. Still, Kennedy's stock remained high within the company. Then came an even bigger opportunity. WWE planned a major storyline where Kennedy would be revealed as Vince McMahon's illegitimate son. Everything was set to go, promotional materials were prepared, and Kennedy was days away from becoming one of WWE's top stars. But 5 days before the reveal, Kennedy got suspended for violating WWE's wellness policy. The storyline was immediately scrapped and given to Hornswoggle instead. Kennedy's reputation took a serious hit internally, but given how much the company had invested in him, there was still a path back to the top. In 2009, Kennedy returned from a shoulder injury and competed in a 10-man tag team match. At one point, he was in the ring with Randy Orton. Kennedy went to execute a backdrop on Orton, but the move was botched. Orton landed awkwardly on his neck, and Randy was furious. According to multiple sources, Orton complained to management that the botch could have ended his career and that Kennedy was unsafe to work with. Just 4 days after the incident, WWE released Mr. Kennedy from his contract. Kennedy found some success in TNA as Mr. Anderson, but he was never welcomed back to WWE in any capacity. Kennedy made one mistake at the worst possible time against the worst possible opponent, and it cost him a chance to become the face of the WWE. But while Kennedy's botch was an accident, this next wrestler intentionally ruined his whole legacy. The Ultimate Warrior was one of the biggest stars in wrestling history. During his peak in the late 80s and early 90s, Warrior was as popular as anyone not named Hulk Hogan. His face paint, his intensity, his entrance with the rope shaking and sprinting to the ring, everything about him was larger than life. When he defeated Hogan at WrestleMania 6 to win the WWE Championship, it felt like WWE was passing the torch to their next megastar. His rise to the top was meteoric, but his ego became his downfall. Before SummerSlam 1991, where Warrior was scheduled to team with Hulk Hogan in the main event, Warrior sent Vince McMahon a letter with a list of demands. He wanted significantly more money, plus a higher percentage of merchandise sales and a reduced schedule. The catch? He threatened to no-show SummerSlam if Vince didn't agree to his terms. McMahon was forced to agree to the demands to save his pay-per-view, but nobody outsmarts Vince McMahon. Warrior competed in the match as scheduled, but immediately after SummerSlam ended, Vince suspended him indefinitely. WWE brought Warrior back after WrestleMania 8 because Hulk Hogan was leaving and they needed a top babyface. But Warrior's attitude backstage had gotten worse. He no-showed several live events, was reportedly rude to fans, and generally behaved like the rules didn't apply to him. When he tested positive during the steroid scandal investigation, Vince used it as the perfect excuse to fire him. WWE eventually reconciled with Warrior before his death in 2014, inducting him into the Hall of Fame and creating the Warrior Award in his honor. But for over 2 decades, his ego kept him blacklisted from the company that made him famous. In 2012, Austin Aries was one of the hottest names in the business. He was tearing it up in TNA, putting on incredible matches and proving he belonged in the main event scene. By 2016, WWE finally came calling. Aries debuted in NXT and eventually moved to the cruiserweight division on the main roster. While he never reached the heights many expected, he was working for the biggest wrestling company in the world and getting a steady paycheck. However, even that didn't last long. WWE released Aries in July 2017 after just over a year with the company. Aries returned to TNA and quickly recaptured the World Championship. But then came Bound for Glory 2017, and Aries' career changed forever. Aries defended his championship in the main event against Johnny Impact. The finish saw Johnny hit his finisher and pin Aries to win the title. But then, Aries immediately popped up after the 3 count and completely no-sold the finish. The entire moment was uncomfortable and unprofessional, and it completely overshadowed Johnny Impact's championship victory. Austin Aries left Impact Wrestling immediately after the incident and hasn't worked for any major wrestling company since.